Final panel of the day. The small matter of the state of the Broadband Nation. I'm not sure how was going to do this justice, to be honest, but we'll do our best. Reading that slide terrifies me. How is the UK ISP sector set up to navigate the challenges of the next 3 years? We were just saying that we were having a pre-panel chat, looking ahead 3 months of this sector as a challenge. 3 years is nigh on impossible. But crystal balls at the ready, guys. We'll see what we can come up with. And then it carries on in its pursuit of deployment targets and FTTP take-up. What could be improved? Well, that's a bit of an oxymoron, right? Because take-up is one of the things that could be improved, and we talked about it at length today. This should be a more detailed discussion around barriers to take-up, around pace of deployment, about the regulatory and environmental challenges to that deployment plan. And we've got an assembled panel here of the great and the good across the industry, the panel to end all panels, I would say, or to start all panels. I can ask them all to introduce themselves. You probably all know who they are anyway. But I want them to spend a couple of minutes telling you who they are, what they do, and where they think the UK is as a broadband nation today, in very brief terms. Can we start down the far end?
Oh, thank you, Steve. It's Graeme, I look after Community Fibre. We're building a big network in London, almost 1 million homes ready for service in London. I think we're at a really super exciting stage. I think the bigger networks now are getting to a point where they can make a real difference to the landscape in terms of consumers and businesses. And I think certainly that those with strong regional brands, as well as some national ones, are actually now able, I think, to make a real difference and win business. So I think actually it's really exciting. Once you've got scale and things are working well and your network's working well, actually you can grow and grow nicely. And I think do what we were supposed to do when we started off on this journey, which was provide real choice overall. So I'm super positive about the next 3 years, despite all those challenges.
So I'm Becca Molyneux. I am at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, so DSIT, used to be DCMS. I'm the Deputy Director responsible for broadband regulation and investment. So that means working with Ofcom on the regulation of the commercial market, looking after the BDUK rollout, and kind of everything in between on broadband, including very hard to reach policy. I've been doing this role just over a couple of months now, and came in from other parts of government. And my reflections are that, everyone's very aware what we did in terms of the last WFTMR and Ofcom's strategic statement of priorities in terms of wanting to promote competition, have a really vibrant market. And that's obviously been achieved. To have this amount of companies out there building fibre is, I think, more than we possibly expected, but it's a real testament to sort of the vigour in the sector, to the opportunity that there is, and to all of your kind of entrepreneurship, your innovation, your expertise. We have the 85% target of gigabit premises covered by gigabit connections by the end of 2025. And I think when we set that initially, people thought that was pretty optimistic. And now I think all the data shows that that's going to be met early, and that's mostly, the vast majority of that's the commercial rollout. So again, it's me coming into the sector, I'm being very impressed at sort of how well it seems to be going. And I know there are challenges ahead, and I'm sure other colleagues on this panel will sort of pick that up, and I'm sure we've been talking about that. But to me, we're starting from a real position of strength, which is really great to see.
Hi, I'm Rob from CityFibre. We are deploying fibre infrastructure to about 30% of the UK, having raised £6 million just pre the economic challenges, more through luck than judgment on timing. But meaning that plan is fully funded, and we're doing that in an open access basis, so we are wholesale only, which means every ISP, whether one of our existing customers, some in the room, or those not, are welcome to make use of the deployment. And things are going well. I share Graeme's optimism that I think and with Rebecca, a policy was established to introduce competition and have a competitive market in the UK, and I think it's great attributes to the whole industry, what's been achieved in terms of the pace of development. And it is a good time to have this event and ask that question, because I think we have now established a pace of competition, and competition has started to come into the market. So there are deployments happening at scale and take-up starting to happen at scale. But I guess I would just moderate that against, one, the industry now finds itself in a macroeconomic context which is much more challenging than when many of us started. And we also find ourselves in a consumer market, at least, where there's still probably quite a lot of confusion. And most of the alternative operators are still not EBITDA positive, and certainly not cash flow positive. So I think the theme I'd say is it's brilliant that we have competition started, but it's really fundamental that when we're here in 3 years' time, that competition is cemented, it's sustainable for the long term. I think that is our challenge for an industry. We've started to get a competitive market. We need to make sure we cement a competitive market in the long term.
James.
I'm James, I'm Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Hyperoptic. So Hyperoptic is a vertically integrated ISP network operator, operating a full fibre network that covers around 1.3 million premises, and we're coming up to 300,000 customers. So I think in light of the focus of this panel, the two key themes that come to mind for me are one, as a couple have already touched on, the macroeconomic climate, rise in interest rates, the debt that many of the operators who are driving this newly competitive environment have taken on, and being able to service that debt shifts the debate historically away from a discussion of prem past and first mover advantage to who actually has a customer base that they can rely on to be able to weather the macroeconomic forces that we're seeing at the moment. And the other is, as the market starts to mature, again, it becomes less about this conversation of a land grab and more about trying to maximize the efficient use of capital that's coming into the market, particularly when that capital is becoming more expensive. What can we do as an industry, I include Ofcom government in that definition, to make sure that is as efficiently allocated as possible whilst maintaining that competitive environment? So we've talked about the number of prems passed cumulatively for the operators in here and as a wider industry, but how much of that is going to be overbuilt in the future, leaving some areas where they still don't have one full fibre or gigabit capable connection? And what could we do as an industry to make that, avoid those kind of inefficiencies where we might see 4 or 5 altnets in the worst case scenario overbuilding, and in another there isn't one. They are complex policy challenges because that brings you into the spirit of competition law. You have to relook at the SSP perhaps, and you have to understand the appetite of future government. But they're the kind of debates that I see coming as our industry moves from one of new challenges to one of maturity.
Thank you.
Hello everyone. Hi, I'm Adam Dunlop. I'm the MD of Consumer and TalkTalk Group. I also look after our relationships and partnerships with Openreach and also the altnet community. So TalkTalk, for those who don't know, actually is 20 years old this year. Happy birthday, TalkTalk. A challenger entrance to the market 20 years ago, which today is the leading sort of value connectivity player in the UK. We've got 4 million customers in our group. We are hugely invested in the success of sustainable infrastructure competition. We work with Openreach, obviously, very closely, but we also work with a number of altnet partners, so 2 of which are on the panel today, so CommunityFibre and CityFibre. Where I think we are, I've been in TalkTalk for just over a year now, and actually the conversation around altnets and FTTP adoption has changed dramatically in that 12 months. So 12 months ago it was all about sort of homes passed and speed of build. Now it's coming back to the real subject, which is adoption and penetration. And for us, we've massively invested in this, and we're quite experienced now around what are the challenges around customer adoption to FTTP, which we are full believers is a far superior product. So I think that's some of the subjects that we're going to get into on panel now.
Excellent. Well, I mean, I've got a series of pre-prepared questions here. I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball in. And it's your fault, James, because you've referenced it. So we've got 15 million homes covered in the UK currently. According to a piece in the FT about 60 about 6 months ago, 70 million UK homes out of 30 million are going to have full fibre coverage by the end of 2025. So to your point on overbuild, is there a future where that doesn't exist? Is there a collaborative future where we just have 1 or 2 fibres past every home? Do you see some of the guys around the table working together to make that happen, to ensure that we get to that full coverage, rather than have 70 million RFS, double counting across probably more than half of those? Who would like to answer that first? I'm very happy for somebody to volunteer.
I think they should be working.
Shall I go? Okay, yeah. All right, so given I'm to blame for the curveball, I guess
You've got to pick that up.
to answer that. So I think there are there's a spectrum of ways you could look at that problem from a policy perspective. So you could say, before we had the FTIR, there was the question of, would you want to pursue a franchise model, which does exist in other European countries, for example. And that's not the path that was taken. So if we do have a competitive network environment, what can you do? And I think if we go back to the FTIR thinking about that problem, there was reference to this hold-up problem where in some areas you might have operators being nervous to invest because they didn't know if another operator was going to invest there. And we've almost seen the opposite of that, where there might have been excess investment, where in retrospect some operators might not have gone there, particularly in your future scenario, to that scale, where capital may have been allocated inefficiently. And so some of the solutions you could get to would be, for example, and Ofcom's recently taken on some powers that open up these kinds of policy remedies. Could we have a position where operators are encouraged to declare where they're going to go? That could be done anonymously, it could be done through data that Ofcom gathers, and then make that available so operators can reflect on where they plan to go in light of where others are saying they are and are not going. And again, extrapolating that as a somewhat maybe urban solution to rural areas, BDUK's recently asked the question about, well, where are operators planning to go? And where they're not, does it need to be a remedy of state aid? But perhaps sometimes it doesn't need to be a state aid remedy. Could it just be a declaration of there is no one planning to go here, therefore we encourage others to reflect on their future plans? So it's as I see it, as a first kind of opening gambit question to the policymakers, so particularly interested in Rebecca's perspective, you've got a range of different options in regards to severity of intervention. It could be an information remedy, it could be changing the very basis of the competitive dynamic. Would any of them be in play in light of the risk that you're flagging about actually we could get these huge disparities in overbuild in some areas and not in
And still have exclusion in some areas.
Absolutely. So I think that's how I see it, but there's lots of questions there about Ofcom's appetite, current government's appetite, and whether any future government, because this will be a multi-year timeframe question, what their appetite would be as well. So there's lots of variables there.
So Rebecca, it probably makes sense to come on to you after that. The government word was used quite a lot in that.
It was. I mean, the government is neutral on market shape in terms of we like competition, we want competition, we want to promote competition and investment. Beyond that, we don't and shouldn't, in my view, have a view on mergers, on acquisition and things like that. That's just not for us to do, that's for the market to work its way through. There may be things we need to do further down the line in terms of consumer protections, but broadly, the government should stay out of that as much as possible. Where we do, of course, have a role is on the non-commercial side, on the UK rollout. And I think what I said there in terms of the information piece is quite interesting, and might pick that up with you afterwards, because, of course, BDUK do their market engagement, they do the open market engagement, they ask about build plans, they then publish their intervention areas about where they're planning to build, which shows that no one else is planning to build there. So there is some information metric there. We've always, BDUK and the sort of 5 billion project gigabit, that's to accelerate build in some cases. We do explicitly recognise that if the government did nothing, subsidised nothing, then by 2030, some of the properties that BDUK are going to build to, or we're going to subsidise build to, would have been built commercially. But it's about making sure that the whole, or as whole as possible of the United Kingdom is gigabit connected by 2030 and bringing forward the benefits. So it's not the case that every single BDUK property would never be built commercial. It's about making sure almost every single property in the UK by 2030 can be gigabit connected.
And you've used the word gigabit connected, so I'm assuming there's potentially a role for wireless in that.
Yeah, we've always been technology neutral. And BGK procurement's our technology neutral as well. It's about gigabits, not the technology used to get that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of any sort of more coordinated way, I think the ship sailed on that when we went down the route of a competitive market. Fully agree with what Rebecca's saying, and I think, so now in that way there certainly is information. The BDK information is useful, really constructive process, but I think now it's a matter of nurturing that competitive market. The idea of franchise or coordinated planning has gone. We operate obviously within rules in which we all operate independently. I mean, I think capital will be rational, and particularly now in the environment that the panel's referred to, capital is probably even more rational. So where possible, I think people are trying to build in sensible areas that adds to national coverage opposed to overlapping. There may be some consolidation or other initiatives that allows consumers to ultimately benefit as far as possible from fibre that is being deployed. We're working on an initiative where we can partner with smaller alternative networks to bring their footprint to the ISP channel that we have. We think that's helpful. It's good to give consumers choice and helpful for those alternative builders to get more take-up. But I think really as we move from having been deployed, we're in a competitive market. Our focus should now come to, over the next 3 to 5 years, making sure that competition can survive. Because obviously networks get deployed, but customers have to come in large volumes to those networks for it to be sustained. And I gave a small promise not to talk about Equinox 2, so I'm not going to talk about Equinox 2, or someone will throw something at me. But what I think that does mean is appropriate and sufficiently strong oversight of Openreach. Because it's not only Equinox pricing policies that can influence the ability of, to have a competitive market. It is implicit that large volumes of customers have to move from the Openreach network onto alternative networks. Otherwise, competition won't exist. So that has to happen. So there has to be appropriate oversight of Openreach. And then I think there is a lot to be gained on consumer information and some of the other topics I'm sure we can touch on, where really everyone wins. It will help sustain a competitive market and help consumers benefit from the networks that are deployed, because it is great that we're at 15, 16 million coverage, but what is in some ways a great shame, TalkTalk have made some great points on this, it's a great shame is that there's millions and millions of households who aren't benefiting from that infrastructure that's been deployed. So I think that is where our gains are to be made, both to have a healthy market and for UK communities to get the benefit of the wonderful work we're doing.
We set you up.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
Yeah.
That's very nice. Look, on the just to give you a perspective about how we look at this. So, on the residential side, on the consumer side, we've got the Openreach relationship with 3 other altnet partnerships. On the Ethernet B2B side, we've got a load more actually. So we are have a cross section of altnet partnerships. One of the things, the criteria that we look at is overbuild, of course, because what we think is in the interest of the UK is also in our interest, is to have a really scaled alternative to Openreach in whatever form, at least one, in whatever form that takes, right? And so our strategy as an ISP, let's say, is to start putting that together, right? And one of the criteria for when we're going to work with a new partner is what is the complementary fit with what we already have. So a brilliant example is just on the panel now. So CityFibre building in London, Fibre obviously London focus. So that's excellent, big tick, right? In terms of future, who else might partner with further down the line? Certainly one of the criteria we'll look at, as well as just high levels of automation which they integrate with us, credible management team, well-funded, complementary footprint. It would be overbuilt. So I think it's, if we're for the sustainable nature of infrastructure competition, we've got to be super conscious that your stats start at 70 million, 30 million homes. Everyone has to avoid that, right? And it might be that some form of aggregation is a way to avoid that.
And Graeme, living in London, you're probably digging works up to 4 or 5 other fibres down there already. So.
Well, exactly, and I think competition's really good. And competition is great for consumers, it's great for businesses because it forces innovation. And you mustn't forget, we got into this mess because there was no competition. Yeah. And that's why we were saddled with poor, slow speeds and high prices. So that means that a measure of overbuild is good. You need overbuild to bring competition, and I don't think we should be too worried about an amount of overbuild. And frankly, if I don't build a property in London because Hyperoptic are there, so I save £1, that pound won't go very far in rural Scotland. And I need £10 in rural Scotland to do the same sort of job at currently at home. So I think we need to rely on capital markets being efficient, and I think they'll be much more rational now than they were 18 months ago. But for those people who are just not going to get covered by normal capital programs, we just need a really slick way of making sure those homes get connected, whether that's voucher funded or whatever. But it has to be slick, has to be quick, can't be complex and sophisticated like some of the procurement requirements are, because that will mean that remaining 30% or so are not going to get covered anytime soon, and they need competition. So we're much less concerned about overbuild for the sake of being concerned about overbuild, because it's actually pretty good in the long run for everyone.
Can we move on to take-up? When we've got 15, 16 million homes that can have gigabit connectivity delivered to the door, to their homes and businesses, take-up, depending on the data set you read, is anything between 12 and 20% of that. It's probably towards the lower end, if I'm remembering correctly. What are the barriers to that? Why aren't people taking it? Is it because the copper network is that good? Matthew made the point earlier that the copper network was well developed, well established, and was delivering an okay service for most people. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on where you think the barriers to take up are. Should we start with you, because you've done some research into this?
Yeah, so I think first of all, credit to Overreach on the FTTC network. It's pretty good. It got us through the pandemic pretty well, right? So credit's due. That part of the problem is as well, a lot of the customers in the UK think that they're on Fibre already, right? That's a sort of separate subject. But I think you've got a baseline FTTC product with 80/20, which is pretty good, and for a lot of customer types, it's at the moment good enough, right? And it's been proven, and lifeline service during the pandemic, etc.
3 years from now.
So let's get a look at it. So we, being in the industry, have no doubts. We're huge advocates for FTTP. And you mentioned we've obviously undertaken a study last year with Frontier Economics and looking particularly on the sort of behavioural attitudes to migration to FTTP and what are the behavioural barriers and behavioural traits, which is actually is super interesting because it's what we all collectively need to address to drive to the end goal, which is higher penetration. So they are things like the behavioural triggers, which one is clearly reward. So for penetration to increase from where it is today, consumers need to see the direct benefit of involving themselves, investing themselves in the customer journey and the installation journey, which is quite intrusive for FTTP, right? So you need to have reward. Why? And if you haven't used the service, it's quite hard to understand the benefits of it, right? So where we need to get to is that it's much more of a customer pull than an industry push, right? And so there are various things that we're working on with some of our partners to make sure that's so blindingly obvious to encourage take-up of FTTP. Starting with things like speed boost, we could go much further. Obviously, free installation, brilliant installation experience. So reward is one. The other one which we have to come across to sort of address is loss aversion. So if you've got something that works and has worked and proven to work pretty well during the pandemic, you're going to be quite scared of losing that. What do I gain from losing this when I'm already okay with it because I don't actually really understand what full FTTP is anymore. So that's another one, right? So behavioural trigger. And then just quite basically ease, right? We've all got a job to do to make sure when you sign up to an FTTP service, it's just brilliantly smooth, right? And I think if we're going to start to address those behavioural triggers, then I think the service will start to sort of really accelerate, and adoption will start to really accelerate. And that is, how do we do that? Well, we've got quite a lot of experience in it, and our efforts are increasingly successful, not least with our partners. So, but that's I think we've got to put ourselves in the customer perspective, the customer mindset. It's got to be very clear what the reward is. And the service and on the installation part has got to be flawless. Yeah.
James, you get pretty good take-up based on the numbers I've seen. How are you doing that? I'm sure everyone would love to know.
We do, and I'm going to be, that needs to be put in the context of the model that we have in comparison to some of the other models in the room. So in a dense urban environment where Hyperoptic was one of the first movers and has built the model of scale rollout and developed the relationships with property developers and built those relationships with new build sites and established freeholders. They are significant barriers. It's not easy to just build a company that does that overnight. So there's a time lag there that we benefit from being one of the first established altnets. But I think stepping back from that, the question more broadly about what are those barriers to take up, I think there are three key ones, and they're hard to ignore. There's price, quality, and quality often mixed with a proxy of speed, and switching. Now, we might say, well, we're in a fairly good place on all those three, but actually there's significant things that need to change to improve them, I think. One, price transparency. We still live in the age of sneaky mid-contract price rises in people's contracts that most consumers aren't even aware of signing up to. And when inflation was at 2-3%, I think there was an almost acceptance that it was an ugly practice that we lived with. Now, with inflation at the levels that we've seen and likely to remain sticky for some time, and the wider macroeconomic climate, that needs to change. Because how is a consumer expected to work out what is the best value for them if they're seeing one price advertised from an operator that actually might not even exist a month into the contract, versus one who's got a higher advertised contract price, but it's that for the length of the contract. That other contract is probably cheaper. How is the consumer supposed to work that out? So I think we can do a lot to improve transparency. On the price, moving from price and then looking at quality, I think it was touched on before by Rob, this confusion about the term fibre and what it can be applied to. And we've all seen the advertisements with a piece of coax and described as fibre. And moving away from that so consumers can be better informed, we await the outcome from Ofcom's consultation. Hopefully that enables consumers to better pick services that are relevant to their needs, and to maximise the benefit of those two pieces I've talked to there, finally getting to the point where we have a genuinely gaming provider-led switching programme where the incumbents can't rely on customers having to come to them first, where they can try a reactive save, and we move to an environment where customers can just go to the operator they want to go to and have that switch managed by them, will be a radical change, particularly for these newer entrants who are trying to bring competitive challenge. That would just maximise the benefits of competition that Rebecca's talked to. I know we're delayed, but the sooner the better for enabling competition across our industry. And I hope Ofcom keeps the feet to the fire of those that are dragging their heels.
So a couple of points for you there, Rebecca. I'll come back to Rob and Graeme in a second. So there's the switching issue, the ease of switching. Love to hear your thoughts on that. But there's also the fake fibre conundrum, okay? And the education around the customers. Any comments on that?
So on the switching thing, obviously we've had Ofcom's one-touch switching programme, which I know has been in gestation for a while, probably taking longer than some people in this room would want. Everything I've heard suggests that it is the right programme, we just need to get on with implementing it, and we're working on that. So I think in some ways that's the answer there, we just need to make sure it happens. On the consumer information point, it is something that I'm very interested in looking at, because I don't see how anyone can really complain about it as a practice in terms of providing consumers with more information. Seems like a good, but again, it's, I'm sure everyone's fully familiar with the regulatory and sort of the way things are set up in the sector. In DSIP we have the few powers really directly is on influencing jobs, but that is something that I think the points are fairly valid and something we need to look into further.
And what clearly you're talking about take-up, but CityFibre were instrumental a couple of years ago in trying to expose fake fibre for what it was, i.e. fake. So you might want to add something to Rebecca's comments on that, but I'd also love to hear about your research programs and how they're going and how they're progressing in terms of take-up and what barriers they hit.
Yeah. No, thanks, Steve. Well, I mean, just first of all, just very quick, to pick up on the fibre cabinet point. I think there's a lot of validity in that, but I think that shouldn't make us complacent on the need to move to full fibre at pace and try and make that happen. Now we are deploying, it's pretty now soundly established that full fibre addresses a lot of consumers' concerns about broadband provision in terms of speed, reliability, and so on. It's also cheaper for ISPs to operate in with lower cost to serve, less incoming calls, less complaints, etc. Clearly the pricing has to be right as well to enable that for ISPs. And wider benefits we shouldn't forget in the lower carbon emissions of full fibre networks and enabling us to ultimately turn off the copper networks, which we will need to do. So I think we do need to really shift the policy focus from build to take up, and consumer information is just a compelling point. So yeah, people aren't familiar with what Steve's referring to. We challenged the ASA in 2018, 2019 around the use of the word fibre from advertising in the High Court. We lost that challenge, but I think I still feel we were absolutely right to bring that to just raise the profile of the issue. It really needed to be addressed in 2018 when we were all starting to go at scale. And whilst we could say that do consumers care about whether it's fibre or some other technology, but that is not, there's debate around whether that's the case or not. But what is clear from numerous studies now is that the consumer confusion around what they're buying is inhibiting take-up choices. I mean, the WIC study recently that showed it might be suppressing take-up by 40%. That is very significant. So I think we are 5 years down the track from when we went to court on this topic, but I think the urgency to address it is still the same. So
5 years and about 13 million homes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also we've got to remember a wider environment. There's some of the world's largest infrastructure investors, measuring month on month how much capital they put into UK digital infrastructure. But if you look across Europe, France, Italy, I can reel off all the countries, have taken firm action. Some have got a traffic light system, some have got use of the word fibre. They have taken action. And frankly, I think investors are saying, this is another important domain where for confidence of investment going forward, action is needed. So I think there's some real opportunity there. And, particularly with Project Gigabit coming to reality as well, we're massive supporters of what government, brave policy approach government is trying to do to speed up fibre deployment as universal as possible now rather than wait. And I think it's absolutely right for people in the communities that aren't being commercially served. We shouldn't wait. So we're big supporters of Project Gigabit, and we've won the first of what we'll hope will be multiple areas where we will be deploying to those further communities. And I think if we think about that, of government money paying for fibre to be deployed, paying for money, taxpayers' money, paying for fibre to be deployed, but then for people using copper to be able to still advertise their service as fibre. I mean, I think that would just be shocking. It would be like putting money into High Speed 2 on a train service between Manchester and London that takes 70 minutes and allowing National Express bus service to say they can drive between London and Manchester in 70 minutes. I mean, that's a hell of a driver if they could do that. It's as absurd as that. So, I think, we're making, it's just an issue that now, it's disappointing it's taken this long, but I'm optimistic now that we can really see movement on that point. And I do think we need to achieve, the benefit for ultimately the people that count, which is the customers who can benefit from the service.
And Graeme, building in London, service significant numbers of MDUs. How are you finding take-up and barriers to take-up?
It's interesting. I mean, everyone's talked about the various barriers. I think the beauty of the markets that we serve is they're very diverse and there's lots of segments. And so we see really good take-up from certain groups, driven either by need, whether it be young, big families looking for a saving. And we see segments that are more hindered by some of the things that we've talked about here. And they're people who are relying more on the bigger brands, partly out of history, partly out of confusion, because they do think they've got fibre, partly out of nervousness about moving to another provider they've never heard of before, or the risk of loss of service. Now, I don't think we can rely on government or ASA or anyone else to do that job for us. We have to go out and persuade them that it's the right thing to do to move to another provider. So you have to build trust. You have to build a reputation for doing everything well and being fair. You've got to regularly communicate that if this is proper fibre, not proper fibre. You can do that job, you just got to take time. I don't think we should rely on third parties to do that job for us. Because if you do wait, you will be waiting forever. And that in part is why take-up is low if you wait. But my advice would be, go for the people you know are more likely to move really quickly and get them. And you can get really good take-up. Take-up in our older cohorts is already in excess of, it's already in the high 30s. And that trajectory is improving year on year, so it's likely to be higher. But we know there's a bunch of customers who are not yet ready. The reasons that have been articulated here. So you just have to work them, and they will come. If you build trust, they will come. Just got to be a little bit patient for those more nervous migrators. And don't forget, they're all going to have to move sometime soon. Those networks are going to close down. So they're going to have to move, so you might as well get ready for that. Build trust.
So talking about nervous people, the investment community right now, they're showing real signs of nervousness around this sector. I mentioned in my opening remarks this morning that KPIs around this sector have evolved along with the sector on these infrastructure funds, and that's mainly what they are. We're all backed by them to a certain extent. When they put the cash in, they said 2 KPIs were infrastructure funds, so build some infrastructure, build it quick, build it cheap. So there was a land grab, a massive land grab to go out and build lots of infrastructure as cheaply as you could to cover as many homes as you could, because the key metric was homes passed. Now those same infrastructure investors are saying to their companies, yeah, great, maybe you can build, but I'm not going to give you any more money to carry on building until you convert. What does that mean for this 3-year vision if the private money dries up? We would like to address that one first.
I mean, I don't think they're as binary as that. Our investors certainly said that build and take up are equally important. I think what's happened is the thing that people thought would be harder, which was build, has happened. And the thing that in theory was easier because it's cheap and fast, hasn't happened. So actually, I don't think most of them materially changed their perspective, but they've been alarmed by the absence of obvious
But there's the fact that cash is now harder to get.
Oh, it is, but I think that's because nearly all alternates have missed every KPI they said they would hit. And that makes any bunch of investors pretty nervous. And when they can't see a path to monetisation, then they're clearly going to be worried about should we throw more into that particular ring. And of course, some won't. I think the emphasis has changed. I think the take-up KPI was always super important. If you didn't think the take-up was important, then you were dreaming.
Yeah, and I think
No, I just entirely agree with Graeme. I think it's incumbent on all of us to build good business models, de-risk our, we've all deployed different techniques from trying to de-risk our take-up and our outlook. So, clearly, markets do change, macroeconomic conditions, do change through the life cycle of an infrastructure business. So, I think investors are still, the capital is still there in large quantities. It's just looking for sound, risk-adjusted, good places to be. And I think there are real positive things happening despite the conditions. I would say Project Gigabit is really positive for investors to see, government bringing subsidy in an appropriate way to the market and investors can access. That's very positive. The investors have liked that in France, for example. So, I really don't think it's all bad news, but I think the key is, we've moved to a somewhat more longer regulatory oversight on the market as well. So there's good news, but people just want stable, predictable, and when they're investing in competitors, they just want to know those competitors have got a fair have got a fair chance of getting take up and competing, particularly with your platform.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to those comments. No, I mean, just to strike us maybe a more optimistic tone, I think we'll get there in terms of the penetration levels that everyone had in their original altnet business cases, but it's just going to be over a longer time period. So everyone's got to have a bit of patience with that and understand. It seems like it's been a bit of a shock, the sort of the mountain of cash that went into this sector until fairly recently. And then suddenly, very quickly turned to a sort of penetration discussion. That's changed, as I said, in the 12 months I've been in this company. But I am optimistic about it. We will get there, not least because it comes switch off. But it's just a little bit harder for certain segments of the market than everyone thought, right? So it's just, the end point is the same. It's just going to take a bit longer. And along the way, maybe some will lose patience, and that leads to other market movements and opportunities.
Yeah, James, I'll come to you on that because you talked about deployment of capital. Right? So it may well be that some of the investors out there are saying, well, look, there are some assets out there that we could potentially go and consolidate. And it might be cheaper to buy them at X £100 per prem, whatever the cost is, than to build our own. What are your thoughts on that?
I think, from my own perspective on how that conversation could happen, I don't think it can happen yet, because I think we are not close to closing the gap between the initial investment case that said we'll get to this level of penetration and we'll deliver a return on compared to this level of cost per premise passed, versus to the reality of, in light of the now not as favourable macroeconomic conditions and not getting to the level of penetration for most of the altnets in comparison to their initial business models, as Graeme spoke to, that gap needs to close. And so I think there will be a period where there'll be some that they won't make it because, as was said, the investor might lose patience. Another, they might have covenants in the deals that they've secured that they just can't get to. And I think some of that will need to start actually washing through so that investors can, as capital ultimately returns to being rational. I think we've had a period where it's kind of been almost too hot. Turning the attention to who has a track record of delivering scale revenue growth and has an existing customer base where they can weather changes in the macroeconomic environment better than others where they are saddled with debt, but I do not have the position where they can readily serve it through an existing revenue base. They're the questions that we're going to be turning to. So I think it will be a period of a rocky time. I think there will be some that probably won't make it, but I think if we all step back and say, well, where are we as an industry with the amount of operators that we have, we would probably all agree that 130 is probably more than we ideally need. So there does need to be a moment of rationality that's going to come through. I think as that happens, the winners, or those who are at least leading the race, will come to the fore. And so investors will start to get a better sense of actually this model works better because it delivers and it meant this model was more resilient. These other models, they haven't done so well. Capital will reallocate to respond to that. I think that's what we're going to start seeing happening now. And I know, Rob, this is harsh because Rob has said he can't talk about it, but I'm going to raise it. Those kind of movements from the incumbent in response to competition start to change the rules of the game. Where before you might have said your business model had this much space when you were modelling your future margin, and that now starts to squeeze. And as you have that and a tougher macroeconomic environment, it does mean that capital will swallow. So I think in that sense it is a difficult period ahead, but we all knew that would come at some point in light of where we are. But I don't think that means it's a negative story from now. I think it's just a natural recalibration where those who have made the right decisions will ultimately be rewarded for picking the right business models.
And Rebecca, from a government perspective, I guess the view, without being ambivalent about it, is that the market will find its own way. There will be some consolidation, there will be some M&A activity, and ultimately the fittest will survive and the customers will benefit from that.
I mean, that's sort of the good definition of competition. We do want to ensure that there remains competition. That's important to us. government doesn't have a view on how many players there should be. We used this phrase recently in relation to sort of MNOs. There's no magic number of fibre operators that we believe is the right number for a public policy perspective. We do want to see a competitive market. I think anyone looking at this market will expect to see some mergers, some acquisitions, because I think any rational person looking at it can just see that not all of these companies are going to be fully sustainable. But the government doesn't have a role in particularly shaping that, other than to ensure that there is a generally competitive environment.
Right, I'm going to open up to questions from the floor now. I'm guessing there might be a few. Can you raise a hand and we'll get a microphone to you? And when you ask your question, can you just tell us who you are?
I'll go for it. Dean Bubley from the Structural Analysis. On the wireless side, we've seen government move to essentially in the latest strategy, distinguishing between sort of basic 5G, what I call proper 5G and advanced 5G. I'm wondering if there's an equivalent on the gigabit side and what that might look like. So could we define proper gigabit, whether that's full fibre or something advanced, which could be symmetric or 10 gig? What might be or perhaps we could do, rather than gigabit to every property, gigabit to every room inside the property. What's the sort of next stage? What works from targeting and policy goals point of view? Not just to Rebecca, but to everyone on stage.
I can have a go. I mean, I think getting gigabit capable in terms of download speeds to 99% is a very, very good place to start, and that's being rolled out in the vast majority full fibre. To call out, I think, what everyone's vaguely talking about, the Virgin network, I understand, is going to convert to full fibre over time as well. So from a public policy perspective, that's the best technology we have at the moment, and that's being rolled out at pace and with our current set of policies. We have been technology neutral, partly because when you're dealing with a fast evolving cutting edge sector, it's important to set outcome goals rather than input goals, because we're not the right place to decide what the right technology solution is. We just want to define outcomes that we want to see, and I do think that's the right place to stay, rather than defining specific technology to get to those outcomes. I think that's the right position for government to be in.
Certainly, if I can respond on that, from a Veneas perspective, in my business, we're big advocates of gigabit wireless technology, and we've built a site up near Durham, 220 homes, all gigabit wireless, because it was just economically unviable to get full fibre there. But they're getting exactly the same speeds as fibre customers 7 or 8 kilometres down the road. So a happy bunch of customers, and a much cheaper to deploy solution. 2 years ago, a gigabit capable radio to go on the outside of a domicile was about £500, making that economically unviable. Now they're down below $80, and we can deliver a gigabit solution across that. Anyone else want to respond on that question? So I think the future is a hybrid future, potentially, in some areas.
Yeah, I mean, there are examples to look at other countries in terms of the direction we should go down on consumer information. I mean, I fully agree with Graeme. I think all of us are doing a lot to try and educate consumers and spending a significant amount of marketing money to try and do that.
The only point I would make is that there are some very big marketing budgets, particularly in BT and Virgin, who also have a lot of noise in the market. The BT, Virgin, and Sky are 3 significant marketing budgets by some means, so inevitably that has a large share of voice. I think the alternative providers and TalkTalk, indeed, Vodafone, that's doing a brilliant job of trying to educate advisors by consumers, but I do think some extra help is needed for consumers, because consumers are still saying they're confused. So we don't have to get into it now, I mean, there are traffic light systems or use of terminology that have been shown to be really helpful in other countries. So again, I think there's value in looking overseas, seeing what's worked in other countries, and taking the best of those rules.
I think we should make it super clear that we can't add to the already substantial levels of confusion as well. So we've got to be really careful on this. Personally, I think the opportunity to intervene around what you call fibre and what you don't, FTTC being called fibre, kind of the horse is bolted. The opportunity to do this was when this market was nascent and emerging. right? We've gone along one track and now sort of changing it. I think it's hugely risky. Now, consumers clearly can have clearer information at point of sale, a bit to do there, but I'm
Our customers don't think they've got fibre, but just.
But I think my overall point is let's be really careful not to impact the confusion.
To address the question directly, I think it's hard to predict what the market will respond to about what the next line in the sand will be. But you could quite easily imagine an environment that moves quite quickly where, for example, a synchronized service is considered fundamental, depending on how our economy evolves. And that could happen quite quickly. And I think it is important for us to reflect on how late this debate about fibre terminology has come. I totally agree. The ideal time would have been much earlier on to give that encouragement to investors, as you spoke to, Rob. So in light of that, what checks are we going to put in place to listen to the market as a new kind of minimum standard that comes into play? And that could be synchronized, it could be techie, who knows what it will be. But I think we need to make sure that as our wider macroeconomic circumstances change and our economy changes in this country, that our policymakers are reflecting on that question. Because otherwise, we leave this standard there for a very, very long time, and we all pat ourselves on the back saying, oh, we're great, we nailed Gigabit, great. Well, actually, so many X jobs are now dependent on an upload speed that has to be Gigabit capable as well, and we've defined our success by the download speed. So we have to constantly ask that question. Predicting what it will be is hard, but I could easily see it going certain ways, and your example of synchronized is interesting because some of the major innovations that are happening right now would suggest that the synchronized speed would become, symmetric, apologies, not synchronized, symmetric. Symmetric would become fundamental if those trends continue. So are we in a world where upload speed becomes as important as download speed? I could see it. So it's a really, really useful question to ask.
Hi, thank you. Andrew Camping, Fortnite Consulting. To challenge this discussion a bit, you're having a discussion about technology, but that's not what the mass market ever buys. If you cast your mind back to when FTTC was first rolled out, when most of the industry bluntly said it wasn't needed and was a waste of money, which seems hard to imagine nowadays, BT invested in content because it recognised you had to give customers something that required the network, because they wouldn't buy your network, they'd buy a product, a proposition. So is the problem here that no one's actually investing in things that customers want to buy, and you're sort of blaming the customers for not buying what you want to sell them, when you should be looking introspectively and saying, actually, come up with something that you can sell me that requires gigabit, because at the moment, it's way beyond what any rational consumer needs to buy. So sell me something that needs it. Don't try and sell me the network, because very few people buy networks.
Yeah. Our experience is that consumers really notice the difference once they've got it. And only doing the same stuff as they were doing yesterday, but they're using a new network and it's a lot faster, and they really notice it, and they really don't want to go back to it. And that's part of the job that we have to do to get take up. So, and inevitably, as networks become more capable, and it's been history of networks, content creators find ways of filling the network for you. It doesn't cost you a penny to increase capability, and I think that will happen. But customers have got it, really like it, and I think competition will drive the next step. We talk about gig. 1 gig is just a stepping stone. It's the first step of multi-gig. We already sell quite a lot of 3 gig, which people say, why do you need it? Well, they do, because they buy it. Now, they buy it at a certain price point, they pay £100 for it, but they will absolutely buy it. And I'm sure if I sold them 10 gig at an affordable price, they would buy 10 gig. They don't need it, but they love it when they've got it.
I think that's right. I mean, it's a great question. It depends on the customer types, right? So last week in my street in West London, Openreach laid full fibre for the first time. My 17-year-old son practically fell to his knees, as did my 14-year-old daughter, right? So this is like the greatest thing that's ever happened. Then I go to one of my neighbours and go, hey, can you get full fibre? Try and talk, they're brilliant. I've already got full fibre. You know, so everyone has different preferences, and I think over time people will really realise that they do actually need it. But we've got to do our job in educating and helping with very clear marketing messaging as to why it's good and it's better than what you've got.
Yeah, not just that, it's another thing. It is a great question, and it's another reason to feel optimistic, I think. And I think if you ask our investors, it's one of, investors refer to sort of tailwinds in a sector, sort of long-term trends that they can have faith in. And, obviously, amplifying computing power and data demands being wrong. But there are already trends happening. So, for example, broadcast moving from broadcast technologies to online. That is already happening. The BBC is talking about when it moves away from broadcast, Sky's moving away from satellite. That is already, so without any whiz-bang metaverse, hologrammatic fridges or whatever we might have, there are already trends. So I think actually we can feel really, really good that there are tailwinds that are going to drive the need, and that is absolutely why governments, actually saying it wants full fibre as a preference because it's glass and it'll withstand multiple endless technology cycles effectively. So I think we should feel really, really good about it. It's just that some of those are quite long-term cycles, and I think, what Adam said, nail on the head, there is a missing out on an opportunity in the near to medium term as well because of the confusion.
We don't underestimate the power of gaming. Without any of us on panels spend a long time gaming, but if you look at the Ofcom sort of media consumption reports, about a 14-year-old and 17-year-old doing a lot of gaming, the trends on that are just going up and up and up and up in terms of consumer leisure hours spent on that, and the latency needs of that drive.
And that's driving the upload as well, right?
Yeah.
I've got 3 of them at home, they're all games, and they need the upload as well as the download. So sharing on various platforms.
But again, I don't think it's, my view is, maybe metaverse will all be wearing those headsets in a couple of years, but I think it's more just an acceleration of existing trends with all TV coming over the internet and a couple of people in their family gaming. You soon actually start to need a little bit.
Yeah, we're absolutely, even in the near term, right, there's debate about at least 2 major streamers bidding for the Australian Premier League rights with the Zone and Amazon's Ambition and so on. And let's see how that emerges. But I think we should feel really optimistic. It's going to happen.
So Matthew's comment earlier about Sony as a hypothetical coming into the ISP space and then seeking to leverage its gaming base to then attract an ISP base, and what that might mean for the wholesale relationship. But to the question, it does prompt this view of what is the bet. So is the future Sky Glass or a version of it, where you encourage the consumer to bundle in as much as they can into a single contractual relationship, and there's the example. All the other add-ons that you're getting through this, that's the justification for you ultimately taking the service. Or is it a bet of broadband increasingly functions like a utility? Okay, I have my utility, I have that line, and I chop and change the service that I take over it constantly depending on what content I want to access or what offers are available. And the content environment moves away from loyalty and it becomes very, very defined by high churn. Now, there are a lot of questions outside of our industry, and many of them would be relevant to Ofcom or the CMA thinking about competition within our market, how competition in our market works and interacts with competition in related markets. Because to Matthew's example, what would the CMA or Ofcom's view be of an entrant doing that kind of example? Would that be permissible? Would there have to be a wholesale must-offer arrangement so that the other model could survive? And you might then, in that scenario, see all of us lobbying Ofcom saying, no, there must be a wholesale must-offer on access to the PlayStation network. Seems weird right now, but in that scenario that Matthew described, that's what we all suddenly start lobbying for. So I think there is a great moment that will come where if an entrant seeks to do something like that, it will prompt the answer to your question, and I suspect it will be answered by competition.
I've got time for one more question. 2 hands are up, and 5 over the mic.
Mine's actually, it's Graeme from Ox and Oxby. I don't know if mine's a question or more of a bit of a debate, but go back to the point about competition and the fact that the market's winning and the competition is actually good. And it's your providers that have driven that competition because there's so many of them now and they are overbuilding. And it's natural, but it's down really to every alt provider out there to decide where they want to build. And if they want to build somewhere that someone else is building in, then that's a chance you take. You look at the model, you decide whether you're going to get takeout, you drive the price down, and it becomes a bit of a fight for those consumers and brand building and, as Graeme said, trust and things like that. So I guess I think what'll happen, it'd be good to get views on it, is that maybe in a couple of years' time, there will be no more new homes to build because the speed that the market's going is with Openreach and the bigger players and the smaller players, you get to a point where you think, okay, we've kind of burnt through the money that we had and we've kind of not really built as many homes because of the competitive competition. So the planning team's looking around and going, where else can we go now? We're in south or we're in north or east. And we built a large area, but now there's nothing really we can go for unless we actually deliberately continue the overbuild. I think that causes problems. Do we see that in 3 years' time, the companies that are, it's going to be which companies operationally cash flow positive now because the investors don't want to put any more money in, and they're the ones that are going to continue, and some will fall by the wayside and they'll get bought up because those assets are now going cheap. Is that how after? I mean, we've all been sat here in these rooms for 5 years now. Maybe in 3 years' time, the argument will be that everyone is now, there's no more money to build because the UK is largely built apart from those tricky areas. And now what's going to happen is that, there's going to be some fallout. And if you've got the money to, the revenue coming in to keep the business ticking over, you're going to be one of the ones that are standing while some of them are going to fall by the wayside. Is that how this is going to pan out?
I think in the long run, you're right, Graeme. I mean, you'll end up with a situation where you're not doing much more build, you realise quite selective. And it'll boil down to normal telecoms economics. Have you got enough scale to be economically efficient to support the low prices that you've used to win the customers that now fill your network? And there aren't very many successful small telcos. There's a few. They tend to be highly regionally focused and build a really big base regionally. But that's not most companies. Most companies need to be quite big to run at telco economics. And that's just the real world of telco economics. So inevitably there'll be consolidation, not from a distress point of view, but from it makes sense because we can be more efficient by being bigger. I think that's what I think we've done.
Right, I think we are going to do one more question unless anybody else would like to respond to Graeme. You happy with the response, Graeme? Sorry, Graeme? You happy with the response? We don't do that now.
Yeah, it's fine. Yes.
Graeme.
Thank you. James Robinson from Assembly Research. My question is kind of grounded in some conversations I've had during the day, actually, and it's about OTS. And do you see that could actually have the risk of unintended consequences where it perhaps could actually facilitate some switching from the smaller players to the big corporates, and or is it just a win-win as a positive for all nets?
Same answer. So kind of guides, isn't it? I mean, sorry, after you.
No, I mean, if that happens, that happens. But I think the perspective I would bring to it is when it goes back to Adam's comment about being 20 years old and the amazing, really, if you reflect on it, the amazing journey TalkTalk went in, and when local loop unbundling happened, and we sometimes look at our retail market and think it's never going to change and everyone's going to have the same shares. But actually, if you go back to 20 years ago, just look what change there was, because there was whilst it wasn't an infrastructure upgrade, it was an infrastructure change. And we had EasyNet, which ultimately Sky Broadband and TalkTalk, and the market changed completely. And we are now we talk a lot about the infrastructure, but what's going to happen at the retail market is really interesting as well. And we've got two of the best examples of it here in Community Fibre and Hyperoptic that are actually becoming some of the bigger sort of second-tier ISPs in the country. It's remarkable progress. So I think there's a danger of looking at national numbers on ISP market share and not seeing the difference at a local level. Like Graeme talks about his over 30% market share in certain areas. What an industry change. So do not believe the retail market can't change. go to other countries where fibre's been deployed, there's typically been new ISPs come in and take a substantial market share, 10 to 20%. There's lots of examples of that. There's also been, smaller ISPs who've grown to be much bigger. And, TalkTalk's been at the forefront of full fibre in the UK and should have a fair go at that. So I think, Graham's point, competition is good at an infra level, it's great at a retail level, but let's give the pioneers, the TalkTalks and indeed some of the smaller ISPs in the industry, let's give them a fair shot at the market. And that's why things like switching and the consumer information is good. We could see a really different retail market landscape in 3 to 5 years' time, and I think that's great for consumers, and we'd love to see that. And complacency can be dangerous. There's some brilliant ISPs who are much smaller, don't get noticed, but are doing some incredible things in the UK. So let's give everyone a fair shot at the retail level as well.
I think with one-touch switch, if we look at all else remaining stable, the current switching environment enabling incumbent operators to have a reactive save opportunity when they contact them, and then that being removed, would suggest overall there will be a gain to the challenger operators. But that is a big dependency on all else remaining stable. And one of the biggest risks is the implementation is poor. And if you end up with inadvertent slamming, you end up with poor communication in the journey of explaining all the changes to the customer's contract, resulting in confusion. Well, those things can ultimately lead to consumers going, you know what, even though it's easy, it's procedurally easier for me to switch. I've heard so many bad things about it, and someone I know who went through it recently went wrong. I'll wait a bit, because that sounds a bit messy and I didn't like it. And you can then actually kind of completely undo the logic of the switching process change, where customers, because of the lack of clarity, are a little nervous to then use the new process. So I think generally it is the right intervention moving to a game provider-led process, and I think we will be the beneficiaries of that change. But it does point to some of the debates that are happening in TOTSCO about trying to make sure the detail is absolutely right, because if you get it wrong and the customer journeys are messy and you end up with consumer harm, then you're actually going to undermine the whole purpose. So it's a balancing act, because as Rebecca was saying before, we are delayed on the implementation of it, and that is not ultimately driving the benefit of competition. But I can also see why they're making sure they get it absolutely right, to your question.
I think that's it, guys. We're out of time. Fantastic panel. Thanks ever so much for your time, all of you. You can go and relax now, and I'm going to try and sum up the day's events in about 3 minutes.